So we continue with the presentation by Father Albert Alejo, Corruption, a Challenge for Sustainability in Southwest Asia. Father Alejo is with us here at the Pontifical Gregorian University. He came a couple months ago. Previously, he has a long curriculum vitae. He is a very engaged person in research, in social action. I just want to mention a couple points from his from his life so far. After having studied philosophy and theology as part of his Jesuit formation, he earned PhD in social anthropology at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And he's been focusing on issues of corruption and integrity, of peace and development, anthropology in the strict sense. He's been very active in the research and advocacy that deal with issues that are important for indigenous peoples. He's been very active in education as well, and he's also a poet. And we are looking forward to your presentation, Albert.
Thank you very much. Is the microphone okay? Can you test it? Better? All right. Okay. Okay. So it's working. Now, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. When I said yes to this, I didn't realize how important this conference would be. My presentation will just be a footnote to the earlier speakers. Corruption is a common thing, and religion. Now, as I joke, usually, scholarship I define as enlarging a footnote from somebody else's text with an ambition to become a footnote in somebody else's text. Okay. Now, when I was preparing for this, I bumped into this book by Cardinal Turkson, and the preface was written by Pope Francis. Cosa c'è all'origine dello sfruttamento dell'uomo sull'uomo? The Pope is asking, so where is this coming from? This violence, this violation of human rights, this destruction of the environment. There's a common thing. It is in the corruption of society, which he traces in the corrosion of the heart. And that's why when we talk about social issues, we really have to go into philosophy and religion, spirituality. There is something wrong inside. The garbage around in society comes from the garbage in the heart. So before I spend my time, let me tell you what I'd like to say. Number one, about personal location, not to promote myself, but to see where I am coming from and my own limitation. Number two, I'd like to say that corruption is violence, and it is a threat to Asia's sustainable peace and development. And number three, I'd like to say that religion has to respond to that. I've been into interreligious dialogue. Corruption very, very seldom comes in. Whereas the biggest problem around us would be traceable to corruption and corruption of the heart. And yet, why don't religions deliberately address that? We have teachings in Islam and Buddhism and Christianity on what it is to be a good person and how to avoid corruption, even cutting the hand, etc. But why is it that when religions talk to each other, they seldom talk about this main problem? But then, of course, number four, I think it's because it will also require an examination of corruption in religion or religious institutions. And that's why I'd like to address that more in-depthly. Okay? Personal location, where I'm coming from, just imagine those 7,100 little islands in facing the Pacific. I come from the Philippines. It's part of Asia, but outborder the Pacific. But more personal location would be I'm bringing with you feelings, sadness and anger because of what I've seen as the results of corruption around. Corruption hurts, corruption kills, corruption destroys institutions, demoralizes people, and produces many immigrants. I'm worried also about what is happening to whistleblowers, to truth tellers, and to those who introduce reforms. I also feel guilty for being part of a church and the educational system, production of researches and books that don't affect people's lives. But I'm also happy that we are talking about this. That means we are part of the problem and also part of the solution. We have among the Jesuits in the Philippines a movement called AHEM, Anti-Corruption Movement. Now, so just a little bit about my activities fighting corruption, and this is my book on AHEM PLO, Spirituality of Integrity in Philippine Church and Society. I work with indigenous peoples, and sometimes we have to encounter guns. And I've been part of the government working in dialogue with the communist rebels. Yeah. And then dialogue with the Muslims. And recently I was assigned to a place where there was war. And more recently, before coming here, I became active in the fight, in the struggle against extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. Under the new administration, we have 1,000 killings a month in the name of the war on drugs. Number two, corruption is also violence. It's not just a violation of law, it's violent, it hurts. It is a serious threat to Asia's sustainable peace and development. Now, recently, there was an ASEAN conference in the Philippines, and the resulting statement said, despite the recent global economic slowdown, ASEAN, the Asian countries, apparently are still moving forward. This is a very vast region with many languages and resources, and so it's very hopeful. But, take note, greater economic integration can also be a resource, a fuel for more corruption, right? Greater economic integration also poses new and larger corruption challenges for the region, according to this expert in Transparency International. If left unchecked, corruption not only risks jeopardizing ASEAN's collective goals, but becoming potentially an even greater problem for each member state. For example, I'd like to quote from the Pew Research Center. In their study, crime and corruption are top problems in emerging developing countries. For example, in these statistics, so number one there is crime and corruption, and they are related. So if and Asia, of course, is the home of Islam, Buddhism, etc. The religions cannot just sit down and pray without facing these problems. Now, according to Transparency International, especially the section on Asia Pacific, 1 in 4 among the population there paid a bribe. That means involved in corruption. That's high, that's 25%. Variations in bribery between nations. If you look at the Transparency International report, Sub-Saharan Africa is has a high bribery, yes, but look at Asia Pacific and Latin America. We are uh, very, very much hit by this bribery and corruption thing. So you have scores there of bribery rates across Asia Pacific. Cambodia 40%, Vietnam 65%, Myanmar 40. So very high, very high. And take note, these are also regions that are very religious. We are very strong on rituals and piety, etc. And who has to pay bribes? Younger people. Younger people, talking about the youth, younger people have to pay bribes to enter universities, etc. Women are equally likely as men to pay bribes as well. Transparency International, take note that only Singapore in that region has a passing rate. The rest of us have poor ratings in terms of integrity. Now, is it stuck there? No, it is growing. The red one, the red color there says 40% believe that corruption is growing, and 33% said more or less the same. If you put the two together, it's really very serious. Now, take note, actions that people think are effective in fighting corruption, reporting it, etc. But take note at the lowest rung. Ordinary people cannot do anything. There is that feeling that ordinary people cannot do anything about this. Now that, I think, is serious. It touches on belief and philosophy or spirituality of hope, and I think religions have to address that. Now there's also another study, Challenging the Culture of Secrecy, a status report on freedom of speech done by the Asian Development Bank. And it says about 20 to 100% corruption reduces 20 to 100% increases the cost of government goods and services, including in Pakistan, very Islamic, Philippines, Christian, Vietnamese, Buddhist, China, India. So it hinders investment. In the Philippines, for example, investors are pulling out, and diverts scarce resources from healthcare, housing, education. Now, even if there is economic development, but greater economic integration also poses a number of risks to region. More cross-border trade, for example, there will be opening of trades. I have been observing our Bureau of Customs. More cross-border trade can also facilitate the cross-border trade of drugs, of trafficking of women and girls and even boys. Increase in the lawful flows of goods, money, and people, the human smuggling. And massive infrastructure projects are favorites of politicians because they can have big cuts. Yeah. So the Transparency International recommends integrating anti-corruption targets precisely in the Sustainable Development Goals. For every goal that you identify in this Sustainable Development project, you have to be very concerned, how can corruption serve as an obstacle to delivering water to the houses? Integrate the sensitivity to corruption per objective. Protect whistleblowers. I wanted to talk about whistleblowing, but maybe we don't have enough time. Sanction paying and taking bribes, empower citizens to refuse bribes, and this takes social movement. Now, I go now to the response of religions. Many religions in Asia must therefore respond by placing corruption in the agenda of interreligious dialogue and interfaith collaboration. I was talking to some professors of interreligious dialogue. I asked them whether in the many conferences done by interreligious groups, corruption was ever mentioned as a main focus. And they said, no, we don't talk about that. It's very sad because there have been interreligious dialogues on climate change, on migration, on education. Why not corruption? I propose that we have interreligious exchange of Buddhist. What are your teachings on integrity and against corruption? What about Islam? And I think we will be enriched. Now, incidentally, it's China that is now calling for religions to help curb corruption in China. According to Asian News, Xi Jinping calls on religions to help fight corruption, and that includes a call to Confucianists and Buddhists and even Christianity and Islam to help curb corruption within the party. When I say hardly the talk, it doesn't mean there was absolutely none. There was an international network of faith-based organizations against corruption. In 2001, they had a meeting as a panel in one of the big conferences in The Hague. And so, as a result, they formed this INFOC in 2001. Unfortunately, that was the first and the end of the meeting. Maybe it should be resurrected. In 2005, there was this meeting. It's a regular meeting of Asia-Europe. And in 2005, I was there in the BALI interfaith dialogue, and we managed to introduce one line in there's interfaith, interreligious dialogue. And it says, in the field of religion and society, one work that we should be doing is combating corruption in all its forms. I think it was the end. But I think there are seeds of mentions that we can cultivate. Now, in a few years ago, I was here also when the Jesuits discussed violent conflicts. I was asked by the immigration officer, what are you here for? To attend a conference. What's the title of the conference? I could not say it was about violence and religion and conflict. I just said it was about peace. But we recognized in that meeting many conflicts and much violence today originate in corruption and bad governance. And therefore, all our efforts for peace, etc., should address corruption as well. So the focus requires, according to the statement, seeking peace in a violent world, it's among the Jesuits, requires expertise and a deep spirituality of integrity that involves the capacity to listen to the voices and the cries of those who suffer abuses. Now, a few years ago also, in 2006, there was a meeting here on corruption. And it said, in the short statement that came out from that conference, on the international level, the fight against corruption requires that people work together, that many religions work together, to increase transparency in economic financial transactions and enact within different countries uniform legislation in this area. Now, there is a book, I realized, there's a book on corruption-free churches, and it says it's a problem, but it's possible. Now, since I don't want to repeat what he said, I'm just beginning to read it. I just tell you it exists. And it has many, Zuckerberg has very concrete recommendations. Now, Stackelberger wrote an article in a journal in India because the edition of this Dharma journal was dedicated on corruption and religions. So more institutions are moving, and I think we need to tap that movement. Okay, the manifold experiences and involvements of churches, other faith-based communities, are inspiring and stirring people to act against corruption worldwide. But there are so many things to be done at the moment. Now, as I said earlier, if religious institutions and leaders begin to talk against corruption, I think there will be a boomerang effort. And people will say, well, clean up your mess first. What about the Vatican? What about the monks? You clean up your mess first before you moralize. And I think that's a very big challenge. Fighting corruption in society demands a corresponding fighting corruption in the self. And so a self-critique of religious institutions really require a lot of mea culpas. Now, in this section, I'll concentrate on the Philippines being having the most number of Christians probably in Asia. A couple of years ago, Pope Francis came to us in the Philippines, and you know, his first speech was on corruption. And he said, reject corruption in every form, in every level, not just in politics, but he also said that to the bishops. And so Cardinal Tagle reminded us not to forget what the Pope told us. Pope, to the faithful, corruption is a plague that robs, that kills. And after that, Pope Francis published a small book on corruption. And the original was Corruption and Sin, but in the English version, it became The Way of Humility. I don't know why they changed that. Corruption is paid for by the poor. Now, as I said, recently, there's this book which I'm promoting. I'm still trying to read it in Italian. I don't think there's an English version yet. But it says, it has a different approach to corruption. It's not just political, economic, it's not just institutional, it's not just a violation of laws. It is really stemming from corrosion. Not just corruption, comes from the corrosion of the heart. And it's everywhere, not just in the politicians, not just in the World Trade Organizations. But because corruption creeps everywhere, that means the churches are also affected. Corruption is at the root of the problems of the modern world. And the bishops of Indonesia said, well, if you do that, then the church must set a good example. Right? Okay? There should be transparency also in the parishes. Now, what about the Philippines? We have been always in the top 10 of the most corrupt countries, sometimes number 1, beating Indonesia. Now, the problem is corruption invades even the church and the academe. So what would be some of the responses? Of course, the favorite response would be releasing statements from the bishops, Catholic Bishops' Conference. That's good, but not good enough because the statements are not taught in the Catholic schools. And one columnist says, it's a product of a Jesuit school, there's a whole history to show that the church is part of the problem. In what sense? Even among church personnel, there are rich priests and very poor priests. Luxurious vehicles among the bishops, and then catechists who don't have the minimum allowance for buying chalks when they volunteered to teach catechism in public schools. Now, that was a critical columnist, but even one bishop himself confronted the priest. Do I use God to get money, or do I use money to get towards God? We who preach sharing, priests, do we share among each other? Why is it that some priests are really very poor, but some priests are able to have 1 month vacation every year in different countries, where other priests are just trying to connect ends meet? So our Jesuit bishop who died recently said, it's a shame. But why are we not ashamed? We have not done enough. And Cardinal Tagle was interviewed. How is it that in your country, which is the most Christian country in Asia, it's also one of the most corrupt? And he says, it is a question that we ask ourselves. It is like a dagger pointed at our hearts, our Catholic hearts. How come this lifestyle of corruption seems to be widespread and accepted? So we in the church are also undergoing a lot of soul searching. Where did we fail? What is happening to our catechesis? What is happening to Catholic education? What has happened to the formation of conscience? And we can continue. What kind of theology are we teaching? What moral theology are we spreading? I remember when I was in theology, 1/3 of our moral theology class was on autoeroticism. Somehow the professors are so concerned about masturbation and not corruption. And so one statement of the Catholic Bishops' Conference was as mea culpa. Today we point an accusing finger at ourselves. We are aware that in other areas of church life, as in parish financial management, some church members and leaders, through loose and dishonest stewardship, stray from the path of righteousness and integrity, and it hurts the flock. And so that's why in my book, there is one chapter there on corruption and communion. That the church is also part of the problem, that makes the church also part of the solution. What's the relationship between corruption and communion? The Eucharist started in the Last Supper. During their dinner, Jesus was distributing one type of circular thing, but Judas was thinking of another circular thing. Now, some of you might be looking for statistics. I'll give you. Because of some scandals, there was a National Congress of the Clergy conducted in the Philippines, and the Pontifical University of Santo Tomas, run by the Dominicans, conducted a survey, and the survey was responded to by priests, 3,000 plus priests, and the result was published in the book History and Grace. What are the I give you 2 questions in the survey. One is on the indecent lifestyle of the clergy, and 2 factors that weaken the institutional church. Take note on the indecent lifestyle of the priest, and this comes from the answers of the priests themselves. Number 1, material attachment and extravagance. 46.8% of the respondents, 1,363. Sexual relations with women and non-women. Habitual recourse to worldly good time, drinking, closeness to the rich and the powerful, and area of superiority in relation to the volunteers in the church, including the sisters. Bossiness. What are the factors that weaken the institutional church? This is even higher. 1,495 priests responded. That's 51.4%. That one factor that weakens the institutional church is lack of transparency and honesty in the management of church resources. I think there is a synonym for that. And you add arrogance and abuse of power and clerical intrigues on who should be assigned to the more rich parishes. It's very sad. And in another book, it was identified as a source of reason for some seminarians leaving the seminary. So in that same book, where the data was published, Monsignor Manny Gabriel interpreted the data. He said, the clergy's inability to manage the church resources due to plain and simple dishonesty militates against very basic human and gospel values. People expect the church not to be like the politicians. But if the church lacks transparent, gospel-inspired stewardship of resources, the institutional church weakens its moral foundation and credible leadership. The church cannot effectively throw critique on the corrupt politicians and the business groups. Church practice weakens her credibility. So if the church is lacking in gospel-inspired stewardship of resources, coming especially from the donations of the poor faithful, who in everyday attendance of Mass donate a little from their pockets, that is very sad. And the result would be a declining church attendance compared to the Muslims attending mosques, liturgies, and the local group, Iglesia Ni Cristo, with 89% of attendance in their own churches. Now take note, I think it challenges not just the church leaders, but theologians and maybe Gregorian. In the 11th Synod of Bishops, the theme was Eucharist, Source and Summit of Life and Mission of the Church. I was surprised to see that sentence. Those who share the Eucharist, those who receive communion, must commit themselves to creating peace in our world, which is marked by violence, war, and especially today by terrorism, corruption, and sexual exploitation. In other words, we really have to include in the catechesis, if you receive communion, you should not be corrupt. You cannot receive communion and continue a life of corruption. Wow. And when I was in theology, I never heard that kind of teaching. Now, but if there is corruption in the church, should it stop the church people in speaking out? For example, right now in our country today, the president attacked even the Pope. I mean, he cursed the Pope, saying, when you visited us here, you created a lot of traffic. Cannot even mention what he said. But he attacks the church for being hypocritical. And he said, there are so many abuses in the church. I know. And so that really silenced many of us. And he tells in public, don't believe your priest. They don't know anything. And so for a while, there was silence. People were getting killed, but the church people cannot speak out because this president even cursed even the Pope. And so some critics said, where is the church now? Maybe it's time for a more militant church. Can't the good bishops think of anything more aggressive than lighting candles? But then slowly, some of the bishops, especially Archbishop Soc Villegas, called for end to drug killings. And I even went to United Nations. This is another lecture. So I think corruption in the church should not silence the church. At a certain point, the church leaders learned, yeah, we, your bishops, are deeply concerned due to the many deaths and killings in the campaign against prohibited drugs. We in the church will continue to speak even if you expose our weaknesses. I think that was the turning point. I think that was the turning point of vulnerability to enter into the public discourse, into public sphere. You register your critique of society, but you allow also to be vulnerable to being critiqued. But when you allow yourself to be vulnerable, then you can discover your own force. But there is hope. Creative energies, courageous individuals, spiritual foundations, and analytical clarity build the strength of these efforts. All these are signs of hope. Take note, if I go back to Pew Research, despite everything, among the institutions in the society, the religious leaders are still trusted. If there are donations for disaster, they go then deliver to the priest, etc. And I suppose in other parts of the world, also the religious leaders. So we should not squander that. We should not waste that. We should not waste that kind of trust. Despite our frailties, people still look up to us, and so we need to take care of them. And we have a pope. There was a survey. How is the Pope rating? Oh, the Pope Francis has very high trust rating. 46% very much trusted, 26% somewhat trusted. So if you put them together, 72%. And it's not only Pope Francis. At least in the Philippines, the past three popes had high ratings, and I think we need to capitalize on this trust. And I'd like to end with popular spirituality. I think there's a lot also in popular spirituality. You know, in the Philippines, we have this Moriones festival at the end of Holy Week. We don't stop at the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We start the drama of Longinus, my favorite saint now. Who is Longinus? Remember, when Jesus was killed, he was buried, they assigned Roman soldiers to guard the tomb. But the Roman soldiers reported that the tomb was open. And according to the end of Matthew's gospel, they were bribed, they were paid to tell a lie. Shh, don't tell the truth. Here's your money. You tell this story that the fanatic disciples of that man stole the body. That's the end of Matthew and the gospel. But in our popular book, a versified Bible, that there is one Roman soldier who refused to be bribed, and the name was Longinus. Longinus refused to be bribed. He starts shouting, Jesus is alive. And in the festival, Holy Week festival, called the Moriones festival, this man Longinus would run around with a mask saying, Jesus is alive. He would be caught, and the drama unfolds. There is a debate. Who are you to think and to have an illusion that the Roman Empire will be changed because of your witnessing that Jesus is alive? And he said, I don't have that illusion, but it is true. Okay, your other Roman soldiers have received their bribes. Now their children can go to Jesuit schools. And no, my principles are not for sale. Okay, we will cut your head. Then cut my head. And it's the mask that falls on the hill. And people would start clapping, "Hail this Longinus." And I am canonizing him now as the patron saint of whistleblowers and patron saint of truth tellers. We dream of a world where truth tellers and whistleblowers are not beheaded. Last week, I made a pilgrimage inside the Vatican, and I realized that if you are saying Mass at the central nave of St. Peter's, you will be facing Longinus statue. Very nice. So, let me end this message. Corruption is violence, and it is threatening the development and sustainability of peace and development in the region, in Asia, probably in the world. Corruption hurts, corruption kills, and those who fight corruption and promote integrity are working for peace. So the ninth beatitude should be, "Blessed are those who fight corruption. They shall be called children of peace." Thank you very much.